South China Morning Post, 13th of February 2023, Why American concerns about China's military aspirations in Africa should center on ports in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. Analysts contend that rather than worrying about Beijing's intentions elsewhere on the continent, Washington should concentrate on the likelihood of China establishing a presence on West Africa's Atlantic coast or important Indian Ocean ports. In Djibouti, near the Horn of Africa, China is based solely on the continent. Nevertheless, according to the Pentagon, China plans to construct more in several nations, including Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya, Namibia, Seychelles, and Tanzania. In the meantime, American forces are stationed in Kenya and Somalia, at an Air Force post in Niger and a permanent installation in Djibouti. In a recent policy brief, Don Murphy, an associate professor of national security strategy at the U.S. National War College, stated that stopping Chinese and Russian bases from being established in sub-Saharan Africa should be less of a priority. The Brookings Institution, a left-leaning think institution in Washington, released the brief last week. According to Murphy, the U.S. administration should concentrate on stopping China from constructing a military station on the west coast of Africa, which might provide Beijing access to the Atlantic via its navy. According to Murphy, the other scenario that should worry Washington would be a facility in East Africa that could severely impact crucial sea lines of communication, slopes, and give China additional potential to project power in the Indian Ocean. She added that other prospective Chinese launching pads in the area should be less of a worry. The article claims that China wants to protect its nationals and firms abroad while securing and maintaining access to resources and markets. Beijing has consistently refuted Washington's claims that it is considering adding new military installations. The U.S. should abandon the archaic Cold War mentality and zero-sum game approach, and stop releasing reckless reports year after year, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs demanded in 2021 in response to allegations of additional facilities. Because of its proximity to the U.S. and the potential for serving as a location for the People's Liberation Army, PLA, to rearm and repair naval vessels during a U.S.-China armed conflict, Murphy said a Chinese naval facility on the Atlantic coast of West Africa would be the most significant Chinese security threat for Washington in the region. Similar worries about a future Chinese military station on the west coast of Africa, particularly in Equatorial Guinea, where China has already constructed a commercial port, were voiced last year by General Stephen Townsend, the former commander of the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM. The military installation on the Atlantic coast worries me the most, according to Townsend, and Equatorial Guinea is currently where they have the most support for it. Senior U.S. diplomats visited Equatorial Guinea in February 2022 to persuade it not to negotiate a base agreement with China. According to the Pentagon, China reportedly intends to establish a military base in Tanzania, Kenya, Madagascar, or Seychelles. Murphy's policy brief states, any of those places might jeopardize access to critical slopes along the east coast of Africa, increase China's force projection in the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific area more broadly, and heighten competition between China and India. 4 of the 7 African ports that can berth large Chinese combatants are on the Indian Ocean, according to Paul Nantulia, a research associate at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at Washington's National Defense University, Mombasa in Kenya, Dorale in Djibouti, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and Victoria in Seychelles. The other 3 are on the Atlantic, Lekki, Nigeria, Walvis Bay, Namibia, and Luanda, Angola. He claimed Equatorial Guinea was not a top contender for a Chinese facility, even if Atlantic ports could accommodate Chinese vessels. According to Nantulia, China is concentrated on a two-ocean strategy centered on the Pacific and Indian Oceans. to solve the Malacca dilemma, which occurs when China's imports from Africa and the Middle East cross significant maritime choke points like the Malacca Strait that are patrolled by the U.S. Navy and other adversaries of Beijing. This strategy seeks to establish strategic maritime strong points, a euphemism for military logistics facilities. The starting points are in the Indian Ocean in coastal states like Djibouti, Kenya, and Tanzania in Africa, as well as Gwadar, Pakistan, and Kyaukphyu, Myanmar, in Asia, according to Nantulia. Authoritative Chinese military writings talk about diverting Chinese traffic away from this strait and overland into China, Nantulia said. Nonetheless, Nantulia noted that China's attention on the Indo-Pacific does not rule out using nations along the Atlantic coast as Chinese naval bases. For instance, the ports of Malabo and Bata in Equatorial Guinea have several benefits, including the capacity to accommodate sizable Chinese warships. Equatorial Guinea might also assist China in extending its anti-piracy operations from the Gulf of Aden to the Gulf of Guinea, an area of growing Chinese interest, according to Nantulia. According to Luc Patey, a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for International Studies, Washington's attention has been attracted to the likelihood that China could increase its military presence in Africa due to the escalating rivalry with Beijing. According to Patey, Beijing typically downplays its military presence on the continent, whereas Washington prefers exaggerating the possibility of China creating new military sites there. Beijing has been downplaying the goals of its military facility in Djibouti for years, even though it now has powerful military capabilities that exceed the logistical requirements of any peacekeeping or humanitarian mission. He said that some Chinese military planners also favored establishing new sites on the continent, indicating that the U.S. was not the only country spreading the word about the PLA's aspirations in Africa. Even though these plans still pale in contrast to the hundreds of facilities run by the U.S., they would increase China's military reach, which is unsettling to Washington. According to Patey, the American military is gradually realizing that its days of going unopposed throughout the world are numbered. According to Lena Ben Abdallah, a China-Africa expert at Wake Forest University and a visiting fellow at Harvard University's Center for African Studies, the perception in Washington is very much a zero-sum game. According to Ben Abdallah, when China gets a military advantage, it is seen as menacing to the U.S. To limit China's impact, the U.S. began to reduce its military presence in Africa a few years ago in favor of other theaters. In certain aspects, the U.S. has responded to China's planning and strategy in Africa, according to Ben Abdallah. This worry about grounding follows this reactionary behavior. Another facility, in my opinion, would strengthen Beijing's sway over the continent and increase its sea might. Murphy argued that future Russian sites shouldn't be a top priority for the U.S. because Moscow has limited security interests in sub-Saharan Africa and is currently preoccupied with the conflict in Ukraine. According to reports from 2020, Russia intended to establish a military base in Sudan and was looking to establish bases in other African nations like Eritrea and Somaliland. Nevertheless, its intentions were abandoned due to the military coup in Sudan in 2021. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, it would have been Russia's first base in sub-Saharan Africa. Patey expressed his skepticism on the prospect of the base in Sudan being reactivated. "I still have my doubts about this idea. Plans have been Russia's main export to Sudan for many years. Proposals for a base for the military. Proposals for a refinery for oil. Many plans but not much execution. There aren't any clear signs now, but it might happen eventually," Patey added.